Hello and welcome everyone to our second episode of Understanding Cultural Evolution. Today, I am with Dr. Sara Matthews, who is an associate professor at Arizona State University. She's a part of the School of Human Evolution and Social Change and a research associate at the Institute of Human Origins at ASU as well. Her focus is on understanding why genetically unrelated humans cooperate in large scale societies. She has been running a field project in Kenya, findings from which deeply contribute to the field of CES. Welcome, Sarah. I apologize for my horrendous appearance. I did trip over a corgi, but you look amazing. Welcome. Why don't you start by introducing yourself, what you do, what your research is about, and how it's connected to cultural evolution?
Yeah, thanks, Farrell. I'm, as Farrell said, Sara Matthew, and I'm based here at Arizona State University in Phoenix. And I guess my main research, there are so many different things that we end up working on, but if I try to distill what that comes down to, I think the core of my research is really focused on understanding the evolutionary basis of human cooperation. And that's what actually drove me into the field of cultural evolution is the fact that you could not explain human cooperation in a satisfactory way without thinking about how cultural processes have shaped, influenced, and kind of fundamentally altered the dynamics by which cooperation can evolve. And so it's almost that I landed into cultural evolution because I needed it as an explanation for the phenomenon that I was interested in, which is the phenomenon of large scale cooperation with genetically unrelated individuals that we see in humans. Came more from an evolutionary biology background. So I did my undergraduate at Princeton University in the ecology and evolutionary biology program. And so I was much more came from this background of working with animals and even eusocial insects and baboons. I got to do a little bit of work during my undergraduate days, and that really interested me in animal behavior and in using evolution to explain it. But it always seemed like within the evolutionary biology kind of view of thinking about things, we could explain a lot about nature, but we couldn't explain that much about humans. There was some stuff about humans we could explain, but then there was this line where, like, okay, and then humans just do weird stuff. They do all this. We definitely are the product of evolution, but there's all this weird stuff that we can't explain. And to me, I, felt strongly that, well, we do need to explain that from an evolutionary perspective. And one of the phenomenon that stood out was our ability to cooperate. I was also very keenly interested in how our ability to cooperate influences our ability for warfare. And so ended up kind of wanting to study cooperation, large scale warfare, and then feeling like I really cannot do this without bringing culture into the mix. And that's when I decided I would do my PhD in an anthropology program and ended up working with Rob Boyd at UCLA for my PhD and getting, kind of understanding what cultural evolution is. That was my, as a PhD student, my first exposure to cultural evolution. And once I felt I got exposed to that framework, it was definitely so enticing to see the potential for an explanatory framework like that to be able to explain not just cooperation, not just warfare, not just the things that I came into the field wanting to explain, but like so many things across the social sciences that people are studying that seem like, bizarre things that humans do compared to other animals, but actually we can start making sense of it through this perspective.
That's awesome. So you said two things, and I want to kind of hone into those things. You said humans do a lot of weird things that biology cannot explain. So or like, natural biology cannot explain. Can you give me an example of what you mean by weird things and how in your opinion, even cooperating with genetically unrelated individuals is weird? Like, why is it an unnatural phenomenon? And two, can you elaborate on what you mean by cultural evolution as a framework? Like, what, in your opinion, is cultural evolution?
Yeah. So I guess I'll first start off by saying I don't feel like the word unnatural is the right word to describe the odd things that humans do, because I think the whole point is that that is natural. We
Mm,
are doing it, and it's this somehow still has to be explained through the processes of
mm,
evolution by natural selection, and that's the goal. So the bizarre things we do, I call them bizarre because they are rare in the animal kingdom, and they allow us to accomplish certain things that other animals have not been able to, like, for example, leave the planet, go into outer space, and those kinds of things, right? That in an objective sense, we can say no other animal has pulled that off. Humans are the only ones. I use the word bizarre to talk about these rare phenomenon that humans have. But I think it's important to acknowledge they are just as natural as tigers going around and finding their prey. So some of those behaviors, I'd say, in addition to large scale cooperation, large scale warfare, I think, the one of the topics you study, religion, and both, kind of religious beliefs, religious rituals, and the phenomenon of institutionalized religion. That's something pretty unusual. Um, the technological, the intense reliance on technology and the rate at which technology has changed over time, that's that creates this really rapid change in human behavior over really fast timescales. 250 years ago, um, we were using tools that looked really different from the kinds of tools we're using today to accomplish what we want to accomplish. So those are just some examples. The list will be long if you think. I think many of these, the crucial question is that, can we distill what the basis of all these wide range of unusual things stems from? And I think that culture is actually at the root of a lot of it. So culture is at the root of humans' unusual cooperative capacities. It is at the root of religious institutions. It is at the root of warfare, in the sense of cultural norms and sanctions that allow for these kinds of collective action behaviors. Culture is at the root of technology that has allowed us to exit the planet, right? So we have these seemingly wide range of unusual things, but then it's really interesting to see that a lot of it actually can be explained if we can explain this one phenomenon of culture, our intense reliance on culture. So you had a second question, which I've forgotten.
I think the second question is, well, we're using the word culture and cultural evolution.
Mhm.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I use the term to refer to socially acquired information. And, there are lots of questions about how exactly we socially acquire that information, how much of it is pure copying, to what extent do we have cognitive attractors that, shape the way that we acquire the information and also kind of change the information that we do acquire. So, to what extent is it emulation? That is, we're just being facilitated by watching other people, but we still have to learn this on our own. So there are a big range of questions about how that social learning happens. But broadly speaking, we use the umbrella term social learning to refer to the fact that this is information that you acquire because somebody else is exhibiting that behavior. Then culture is basically socially acquired information. And cultural evolution, uh, the broader study of how we can understand human behavior through the process of socially acquired information changing over time. So that's kind of the cultural evolution part in some sense is basically we are acquiring social information. That transmitted information changes every generation through various processes like, we selectively retain certain information. There are errors in our copying. There's innovation. There's intentional deliberations that lead to change. There's a whole bunch of things that cause the social information to change. And understanding the forces that lead to that change is what I would call cultural evolution. The field as a whole, I think, tackles two things, two aspects of it. One is, what is our psychology that allows us to acquire and transmit culture, and more social evolutionary perspective, which is, how has those psychological mechanisms changed our social institutions and technology over historical timescales.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's come a little bit to warfare, which is something that you spoke about. Would you call warfare bizarre? Because we see conflict among animals quite often. So what would you say makes warfare or human warfare bizarre? And can you kind of explain how it has evolved over time, what function it has served, maybe the current state of warfare, even if you can shed some light on maybe how the Cold War is different to how we did warfare before, and maybe how these changes have come to be. I know this probably is not in your full area of expertise, but maybe if you could shed some light, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so you're right. There is warfare in other animals. It's not that common. There are a handful of species in which we see lethal coalitionary violence
Mm.
that is being exhibited towards individuals from another group. And that's in some ways what we might want to define as warfare, because that you start getting the intergroup conflict and the fact that this is a collective conflict. It's not just one individual from one group fighting with one individual from another group, but that there's a coalition, some cohesiveness
Mm.
on one side at least. So that type of behavior, yeah, we do see it in a few different species. But aside from eusocial insects, which do a lot of hyper cooperative things just like humans, we don't see warfare at these large scales that humans are doing it in. And we don't see warfare that is coming at a great risk to the individuals who are actually engaging in war. So when chimps do their attacks against outgroup members, they are doing it such that they minimize how much risk they bear as attackers. They need to greatly outnumber the individual that they're attacking. So chimps usually don't die when they're attackers, but we know that humans die when they're attackers. We're willing to go to
Mm.
war knowing
Mm.
that they can actually die doing this. Yet the benefits of doing it are going to a very large number of people sometimes. So that's the part that is unusual. And then compared to you social insects who do large scale warfare, human warfare is different in that we can't explain it through genetic relatedness in a way that at least partially we can begin to understand how you social insects and why you social insects wage war. So I would say that humans are the only species that engage in large scale warfare that comes at a personal risk, to a high personal cost to individuals, that benefits where the benefits flow not just to that individual, that cannot be explained satisfactorily or sufficiently through genetic relatedness. So that's a pretty bizarre thing that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds really bizarre. So why is it that you think that we do go for war? And I know that sounds so counterintuitive that you would want to go and kill yourself for a group. So, I mean, as a cultural evolutionist, it seems pretty obvious. It's because it enhances the functioning of the whole group. But why, in your opinion, is it that warfare is so it's such a common phenomena amongst humans and across so many cultures?
Hmm. Yeah, so I actually think of warfare as essentially just one kind of large scale cooperation that humans do. And the same mechanisms that allow humans to cooperate are the mechanisms that underpin warfare. So, what are these mechanisms that are allowing humans to cooperate? Well, one of the most important avenues of human cooperation comes through norms and the enforcement of norms by community, peers, people around you through social sanctions. So, social disapproval, social approval, they're both, I think, just two sides of the same coin, whether it's social rewards, social sanctions. But humans use norms as a very central means by which they organize their cooperation. And that explains why you get a great amount of variation across societies in the way that humans wage war, who they wage war against, what the rules of war are. You know, there are rules about how much damage you can cause. All of that varies across societies so dramatically in a way that, chimp warfare doesn't vary across different chimp communities, or hyena intergroup lethal aggression has a kind of more of a prototypical pattern, whereas human warfare, I think, is just characterized by variability across societies, across time. And that variability, I think, stems from the fact that warfare is a product of the evolution of social norms in different cultures at different periods in time that, provided incentives for people to engage in this. And those incentives come because you have norm enforcement. That is, you're socially people who go out and fight and take these risks. You're socially disapproving people who are being cowards or who are, shirking when the group is threatened and there's need to mobilize a defense, etc. So I think, war in humans is normative. That is, there is no war in human societies when there are no norms in those societies that tell individuals that doing this is a good thing, is the right thing to do. And if you do this, everybody around you is going to shower you with, approval, status, and, the good things that come with status, which is, ends up translating into resource benefits and stuff. If societies don't have that norm, then people won't go and start fighting, mobilizing and start fighting. So I don't believe that we have a psychology for warfare. I believe that we have a psychology for norm acquisition and norm compliance. And that psychology is what drives people's participation in warfare. And in some societies, these norms require warriors to lose their lives on the battlefield. And if they don't, they cannot even go back to their hometowns because they're so shunned by their communities that it's not worth trying to make a living back in your hometown. So, people, for instance, who were deserters in the US Civil War were less likely to return to their hometowns. An analysis done by Dora Costa and Matthew Kahn, two economists, showed this in a really powerful way. And also my own work has shown that, Turkana warriors who are seen as cowards and deserters, they face a huge amount of ridicule and disapproval and criticism, and people just keep bringing up, to them that, hey, you did this. And sometimes those talks kind of build up. Everybody's talking, oh, this person was, lagging behind when we were being attacked by the Toposa. That's one of the groups that fight the Turkana. Sometimes that results in explicit corporal punishment, where a bunch of people get together and even beat the person who's a violator. They're less likely to help those individuals if those individuals need help. And so there are all these moral sentiments that are elicited when people hear about somebody who was a shirker. But if you go to a different society where there are no norms that expect men to go travel 50 kilometers to another land and open fire and take those people's livestock and bring it back, you're not going to see warfare. There isn't a human desire to do this. In humans, that desire is coming from these social norms and our strong motivation to comply with those norms and to feel the approval of the people around us.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you possibly, before I want to move into your work about Kenya, but could you possibly, in your expertise, shed some light on why and how the nature of warfare has changed over time? I mean, it's changed from a lot more like hands on violence to a lot more like passive aggressive threat of like nuclear warfare and like, I mean, barring what's happening in Israel and Palestine right now, but like just generally, even the Cold War was very much like shunning products, not buying products from one block of countries, etc. So why do you think and how do you think warfare has changed so much in nature?
Yeah. So it's exactly because warfare is a product of our cultural norms and cultural technology. We wouldn't be able to explain this variability over time if that wasn't the root of, our motivation for war.
Mm.
So technology has changed profoundly, and that leaves societies with different strategies at their disposal, and it prompts changes in the social organization of societies. It prompts changes in how militaries organize themselves in order to fight. So for instance, in the Turkana in Kenya, the pastoral Turkana used to fight with spears. They used to go on cattle raids with spears, metal spears. And in the late 1970s, firearms started spreading through the area. And so, in about 10 or 15 years, then raids changed to be mostly using semi automatic rifles. And that changed the certain things about how they went on raids. It changed things about the size of the raiding party. It made raiding parties smaller. So any technological change also has all these downstream effects on changes in how then military society is organized, how the military is organized. But I think one of the things that you are bringing up gets at an additional issue, which is that there's also been a lot of changes in the norms around war. And I think one of the big things that is kind of striking about more contemporary warfare is that there are rules, there are international rules about combat. There are, crimes of war. It's not that, you need to only think about your own group and your own group's mission, but that there are sanctions that are being exerted by others, by a larger collection of societies, if one society is violating certain norms of war in some ways. So that, I think, is probably less present in human warfare up until more recent times. I wouldn't say that it's completely absent. It was definitely a thing in internal warfare, that is, warfare within cultural groups. People of the same culture had many more norms of restraint and things like that. But external warfare, I think, was much less likely to be regulated by norms of restraint, etc. And that actually has, I think, very interesting consequences for psychological phenomena like PTSD. So some of my work with Matt Zefferman, who's at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, was focused on understanding, what role does moral injury play in PTSD symptoms. And one of the things that happens, well, our prediction was that because war is a very normative thing, people are very keen to follow the norms. And the norms can be very complicated because it's not just like, oh, there are outsiders and insiders. and you can do whatever you want to the outsiders. Every society has like very specific kind of rules about how that war gets orchestrated. When people violate those norms in battle, they can basically, we argue that some of the symptoms of PTSD are a psychological response to mitigate the social damage that comes from committing norm violations. And what we found was that, moral sphere is a people's, how expansive people's moral sphere is one predictor for whether they'll get these symptoms of PTSD associated with moral injury. That is, the more they have concerns about the outgroup, the more likely they are to have, these symptoms. And we also see higher rates of PTSD of these symptoms in U.S. soldiers compared to Turkana. And again, yeah, in the US military landscape, it's a very complex landscape in which you have to think about harm to civilians much more than you have to do in Turkana context. You have to think about, the trade-offs between accomplishing your mission and how much damage you're instilling on your opponents, etc. So that lends itself, that complex moral terrain, that lends itself to much higher rates of moral injury.
That's that's really really interesting work actually. Can you define what you mean by moral injury, and also can you explain why these symptoms would socially mitigate outgroup concerns? Like I would.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's understandable. I summarized a very complicated argument in 2 lines.
Yeah,
So I'm not
yeah.
surprised that I didn't do it justice. So first, to respond to, what is moral injury? Well, moral injury was defined in the trauma literature, somebody named Brett Litz, as, psychological damage that comes from perpetrating or witnessing things that violate your deeply held moral beliefs. What Matt and I were trying to do is think about what exactly, what should be drive that from a more evolutionary sense. Why should we have those responses? And if this is a functional kind of evolved
Mm,
response to some kind of selection pressure, what should those symptoms kind of look like?
mm,
And so what we did was we kind of categorized some of the symptoms of PTSD
mm,
as, especially the depressive symptoms, as ones that overlap with, experience, how people react when they are ashamed or feel guilt. And there are hypotheses, evolutionary hypotheses that people have laid out about how the response to shame is a way of mitigating social damage. The guilt response is a way of reducing the damage once you've committed a violation, etc. So we looked at the kind of broader evolutionary literature about, how people respond to what are these protective mechanisms that people use to reduce, once they've committed a violation, to reduce the social damage from that violation. And we used that to kind of then zone in on a subset of PTSD symptoms that have more to do, that overlap more with with those kinds of responses. And so we then label in our work the moral injuries basically those depressive symptoms that make individuals withdraw from a particular activity because they are perceiving that they are experiencing social sanctions because of that, or they feel that others are not kind of following the norms in the way that they are. In other ways, they're not getting rewarded, they're not getting endorsed and validated for complying with the norm, or they're getting sanctioned for complying with the norm, or they accidentally did not comply with the norm, and so now they have to kind of reduce their social damage from it. So we kind of concretized that kind of moral injury as not just a psychological trauma, but we kind of pinpointed to specific symptoms of PTSD that should be seen if people are experiencing these moral violations. And we did find evidence supporting that in our work, where we found that more exposure to moral violations was predictive of higher rates of depressive symptoms, but not of these other PTSD symptoms. And combat exposure was more associated with these other symptoms and less associated with these depressive symptoms. So it seemed like, PTSD symptoms can be kind of grouped into functional responses, different functional responses, one to reduce the risk from combat exposure or other kinds of physical dangers, but another set of responses that are more protective, that are more product of gene culture coevolution, in which people in a normative world. So people, this is a psychology that you would only get if we've been living in a world where norms have played a really big role in determining our, to what extent we're going to succeed or not succeed, is very dependent on whether we're going to comply with local social norms or not. And I think you had asked, how does this relate to out-group stuff? Well, I think one of the things I didn't make clear is that this is still about in-group, how your in-group considers your behaviors. So a lot of times killing is um, killing is restricted, and norms can change so that one group might have been it might have been okay to wage war and destroy the property of these people, but 10 years later, it's not, and so people will look back on you know your action in different light when now you're at peace with this other group. Or so there's lots of reasons why an in-group member might consider you to have committed a norm violation in war, even when you're attacking out-group members.
Maybe I mean, my question is, does having PTSD or signaling the fact that one has PTSD kind of also play a role in mitigating social judgment from in-group?
So, yeah, that is actually the pathway that researchers who've worked on shame and guilt have actually argued. Because if this is a response, then it has to be the case that people who express this response are less likely to be judged as having done something wrong, or that the punishment that is directed at them is lower than if an individual doesn't express these symptoms. And that work has been done by more of the evolutionary emotions researchers. And I think there's a good, it's not deeply conclusive yet, but I think there's a lot of interesting suggestions that yes, when people express guilt, the amount of sanctions they face is less than people who committed the same act but don't express the guilt. So there's some experiments that support it, etc. But clearly an area where it would be interesting to do a lot more work. And what's interesting from a cultural evolution perspective is that these are all predictions about what the human psychology should be like, only because there has been culture and a deep reliance on culture and social norms and social norm compliance, because we wouldn't need a psychology that mitigates these damages from committing norm violations if we didn't have this long, deep history of being a deeply normative creature.
That makes so much sense. Okay, having said that, this is so interesting and I can keep going on about it. But let's get into your work in Kenya. What are you doing there? What are you finding there? What is this continued project about?
Yeah, so I guess my early work in Kenya was focused much more on the question of warfare, large scale cooperation warfare. What is the mechanism that's allowing a population that is politically decentralized to mobilize hundreds of people to go take huge risks in these cattle raids that they go on? And that work, I think, has been very useful for documenting how cultural norms and decentralized enforcement of cultural norms, peer sanctioning, can work, how powerful that mechanism can be to, make people do these things that I think otherwise people associate as mostly a product of centralized coercive state institutions.
Sorry to interrupt you, but can you give me examples? Like, what do you mean by politically decentralized? Is this a specific group of people in Kenya? Could you like give me a little bit of context? Because I'm
Oh,
not
yes, yes. I think I
sorry.
haven't introduced the ethnographic context. Which I always do in a talk, but I forgot this time. So yeah, the Turkana are the group that of people that I work with, and they are a semi-nomadic pastoral group based in the northern part of Kenya, very close to the border with South Sudan, Uganda, and Ethiopia. And so they are currently occupying an area that is only weakly influenced by the nation state institutions, although that's changing over time, and will continue to change. But they, as a result of not having that much government control in these areas, there's still a lot of interethnic cattle raiding going on. And that's, when people mobilize to go some distance to another group and use combat, open combat to forcefully acquire livestock and drive them back to their home communities. So that's context, and I think one of the very interesting results from that work is that you don't need political centralization to organize large scale collective action. In fact, collective action that you see in warfare is one of the most conspicuous and costly kinds of collective action, where people are literally risking their lives, and they are doing it without being forced by any one single institution or person who has the power to make them do that. Instead, they're doing it because there is kind of this community norms about that being the good thing to do, that being the right thing to do. And when people are violating those norms, they're getting ridiculed, not by any particular individual, but just by, their communities at large. And it was, to me, one of the most interesting things about that work was just to document how these kind of decentralized, grassroots, small scale, informal processes, those are various different names that I think sometimes connote the type of social systems that the Turkana are following, how powerful those mechanisms are to allow to make societies be able to do pretty much one of the most dramatic forms of cooperation that humans engage in.
That's really, really interesting. Um, so what is something, what are some specific insights that you have gained from your time
Yeah.
on the field that,
Hmm.
maybe contribute to the field of cultural evolution, in
Hmm.
your opinion?
Yeah. So I think one result that really kind of stood out to me in my earliest work in the Turkana was what a contrast. So, I talked about how these social norms and their enforcement can make people take these big risks. But I did this study where I kind of contrasted how people respond to warriors who go and raid another Turkana community. And the Turkana are a really large group of people. They're about 1 million people. They spread over, hundreds of kilometers. And so it's not like when I say you're going to another community, I'm saying, you're going to the people and right there. They're traveling an equal distance to go to another sub-territory of the Turkana, raiding animals from there, coming back and giving it, sharing it with the communities in this area. And there was just this very stark kind of difference in how they conceived of those warriors versus warriors who would go to another ethnic group. So the Toposa, people who went to the Toposa were people who you would want to praise and you'd bless them, and women would be singing for them, elders would bless them, there'll be feasting and goats being killed for these warriors when they come back. But if they go to another Turkana territory, they're criminals right there. They are these people, they don't want their animals, they don't want all the stuff that's coming from good stuff that's coming from them. These are bad people, they're criminals. And that kind of prompted me to think about, so there are norms, but these norms kind of have particular social boundaries, and some people are part of this social in group and some people are not. And I think one of the really interesting projects we did later on was then to test specifically the predictions of cultural group selection in shaping these cultural norms. And so cultural group selection would make the prediction that norms about large scale cooperation, norms in which, the larger the scale of cooperation, the better it is for the group of adherents of that norm, will, when it spreads through the process of cultural group selection, will be such that the norm will be such that it benefits the group of people who are culturally similar. The project that we did was basically then to traverse through many areas of northwest Kenya where various different pastoralists live. And this is work that I did with Carla Handley, who was a postdoc with me at the time. So we went to areas occupied by Samburu, Rendile, Borana, and Turkana pastoralists. And these are 4 different ethnic groups. And we sampled people from different clans, different sub-territories of these groups to see where exactly do you get the cultural boundary? Like, is it at the scale of clans? Is it at the scale of territories? How is cultural information structured in these populations? And these are cultural beliefs, like traits, like, how would you treat your younger brother when, very specific traits, like, yeah, do you drink soup before your elder brother drinks soup? Or what do you do when somebody's committed a crime? Who's expected to go on a raid? Is there an initiation process to join an age group? Do you circumcise? Those kinds of cultural traits, to see how are these cultural traits structured in this vast area of northwest Kenya among populations that all follow subsistence pastoralism and all have semi-nomadic pastoral strategies. They're all competing against each other for limited resources, etc. And we found that, that the ethnic boundary is a very important boundary for structuring cultural information. That means, the Turkana spread over a vast area of northern Kenya, and they're divided into different sub-territories, yet they're really culturally homogenous in this really large, like, set of people. And that's kind of why they still consider themselves Turkana, that they identify as being one people, because it is true, their cultural norms from Turkana, from different areas, are way more similar to each other than Turkana or the Samburu and the Turkana. And physical distance is not what's driving this. It's there's something else, like, ethnic grouping is structuring cultural information. It's creating cultural groups in some ways, and that means then these cultural groups are competing with each other, and norms are evolving that benefit the cultural group. And that's why you see the emergence of these norms that are telling people that, hey, I shouldn't, that, we can't attack other Turkana, but we can definitely go and attack somebody who's not a Turkana. So I thought that was an interesting study because it very carefully tested the predictions of cultural group selection in terms of the scale at which cultural group selection should be happening, where it's going to be most important. So we suggested that it's going to be most important along the ethnic boundaries in this case, and also if that process is going on, what should the social scale of norms be? And we showed that there's a strong relationship there. The
That's really
social
cool.
scale of norms, yeah.
So, what what is something that is creating this ethnic boundary is my number one question. And the thing that, if the clan is so widely spread, I'm sorry, can you help me say the name?
Turkana.
Dracana. For
Yeah.
some reason, I'm thinking Game of Thrones, Dracarys. Anyway, sorry, Dracana. We've heard of cultural evolution in terms of responding to the social ecological landscape that a person lives in. That's pretty so like cultural groups and the norms they follow adapt and change in order for the group to adapt to the situation or the space that they live in. So what is preventing the Dracana, who are so spread out, from having different norms that kind of allow them to um, adapt that local specific ecological space in which they exist, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, no, very good question. And I think that this is the question about how culture changes. So as we talked about much earlier in this interview, there's a bunch of things. Culture never stays the same. There's a whole bunch of forces that are changing, what is the set of information that people are going to retain, how they're going to modify it, and how it gets transmitted. So, change is the one thing we can be sure will happen. But one of the big drivers of cultural change is that there's less contact between people. So, when groups spread over large distances and then people from one end are not that much interacting with people from this end, there is inevitably going to be cultural change. And just from what we call errors in the cultural evolution literature, that every time you transmit there is variation, and when people are then not seeing all of the potential role models, they're essentially copying the errors from certain areas, and that's how language change is happening, for instance. The Turkana, though, they're very mobile, and so people travel like 100 kilometers to actually go say hi to a friend, and they have like some of their animals with people in different parts of the Turkana area because they need that to manage the risk, because they're following, this is semi-arid pastoralism where you can have droughts, diseases, raids, that kind of wipe out your animals, and so you kind of need animals in different with different people all over the place, and you need to also be able to like travel to find grazing areas, etc. So because of that mobility, that's part of the reason why there's potentially still a lot of cultural homogeneity. But I don't think that's a forever thing.
Mm.
Eventually the groups might will get big enough, and there's going to be enough cultural divergence that people start identifying them as in a different way, and we see that happening all the time, ethnogenesis. So nothing to stop that from happening, except in contemporary societies, because of technology like computers and social media and things like that. There's a huge distance is not a barrier to contact between individuals across different communities, different areas, different subpopulations. And that, I think, can profoundly change how large the scale at which cultural similarity can exist is. Because, and I mean, that's what we call globalization. There's a homogenous culture that's emerging, spread over multiple continents. That and I guess you're one of the people who kind of is doing a lot of research to understand more about the world outside of weird societies, right? But weird it's a cultural group, and that spans many continents. And that, I think, is because that level of cultural homogeneity, I think, definitely has to do with more recent cultural communication
Mm.
inventions.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. What a That's something that I have been thinking about as well. Like when I think about cultural dichotomies, and I'm like, how valid are these cultural dichotomies given increase in globalization and
Mhm.
technological changes? Um, yeah, but having said that, this was a great conversation, and I know we're a little above time. I want to, before we wrap, I just want to quickly get your opinion on why our listeners should consider joining the Cultural Evolution Society and what can they get from it as an ex-president of it.
Yeah, so I mean, the first reason is that it's just such a great group of people and it's an extremely collegial society. And I think actually, more so than anything, that is one of the features that I think really should draw in people, because people who are joining there, it's a very pluralistic kind of society in terms of, entertaining different ideas about cultural evolution, entertaining different ideas about human behavior, some of which are not very reliant on the role of culture. So there's enough pluralism, theoretical pluralism in the society that I think is healthy and welcoming. I think that the society has done a lot to follow best practices, includes creating inclusive spaces, in increasing diversity of people doing cultural evolution research. And that has, I think, kind of made it a very vibrant community with new people, new faces that you don't just see and hear about all the time, but kind of fresh, diverse talent. And I think we do try our best to be supportive of increasing this diversity and putting our money where our mouth is in terms of spending money to kind of support scholars from underrepresented areas and populations. So those two facts. And I think that intellectually, the field of cultural evolution is actually probably the only theoretical framework that one can reasonably say can unify the social sciences. And that's a pretty big thing. So it has a huge amount of explanatory power, and we need more people doing, using various different disciplinary methodologies to kind of collect data. I mean, cultural data is spread across all these disciplines. I mean, history, sociology, political science, economics. This is all human culture being studied in smaller or more compartmentalized or specific ways. And so, people should join because there is space for every social science discipline. And there's also the people who study animal culture. I think that's more, people see that connection more. But I think that, historians, economists, and psychologists, and everyone who studies human behavior, have a place, have an intellectual connection with what our field does. And so those are, I think, three very compelling reasons. We're a really fun group. We follow best practices and we try hard to do that, to build an inclusive and diverse community. And we have an intellectual framework can that can be exploited and has so much potential to kind of bring together different areas of research across the social sciences and natural sciences.
Absolutely, and I can attest to all of that
Yeah.
as the student rep,
Huh?
inclusivity.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for your time. I
Mhm.
really, really appreciate it. And I know these insights would be helpful for the whole community who is listening.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Farrell. Thanks for your time doing this.